You are listening to a review by The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
G'day listeners, and welcome to the first episode of The Dead Prussian Reviews. These short episodes aim to provide you with a quick book or film review. In fact, we're not limited to the type of texts we will provide. You may even find that we will provide you with reviews for monuments, plays, activities, and whatnot throughout the coming year. Each review on the show will either be done by myself, your host, or someone who has met our secret expert criteria. And that criteria is a little looser than the interview criteria, but still stringent enough to protect you from audible rubbish. I will also use this fortnightly episode to provide you with updates on our planned guest list and any other important bits of information that we think you, the Dead Prussian community, should know. Before I get to this episode's review though, it is probably a good time to mention how you can support the show. We are, as you know, big fans of the review and subscribe functions on iTunes and other podcast apps. The more reviews and subscriptions we have, the more likely other listeners are to join the conversation. So if you want to support the show, head on over to your app, write a review, and subscribe to us for free. I must say a big cheers to you all, actually, or as my US listeners would say, y'all. Your response to our first episode of 2017 was amazing, or totes amazeballs. It was the chat between myself and Bled Bowen on war in space. It may have had some big Carl in there, but I think the Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica stuff more than made up for all the heaviness. In fact, I know it did because it smashed our 24-hour download record. It then smashed our 7-day download record, and as such has been our most popular episode so far. I'd like to think it was my jokes rather than Bledden's puns, but let's be honest, Bledden has great puns. Bledden, you got great puns, son. If you haven't heard it yet, it is time to stop living in a vacuum, get out there and download the show. You will find out how war in space is, in fact, already happening. Now, as you know, the Dead Prussian podcast is a labour of love, but unfortunately we can't pay the running costs with just hugs and kisses. Believe me, I tried. They didn't even let me pass the lobby. I was just standing there with my arms out looking like a bit of a galah. Not cool. A little bit of financial support from the listeners goes a long way to keeping us on the digital airwaves and in your ears. You can help out by visiting www.thedeadprussian.com/support.html. Alright, that is enough tin rattling for reviews and coin. Time for the first review. This time it is a book, and it's by an author who approaches war from an archaeological point of view. The book is War. What is it good for? Now you may say absolutely nothing because you know the song. You love the song, and I encourage you to sing the song after the episode. For now, keep your ears open and your mouth shut. The book, not the song, was written by Ian Morris. He is the Willard Professor of Classics and a Fellow of the Archaeology Centre at Stanford University. The book is a long-duration history look at conflict and how it has shaped civilization from the primates through to robots. It spans human history in total. This breadth does not, however, prevent a detailed look at how conflict has affected specific civilizations. In fact, Morris does well to use case studies to highlight his argument that whilst terrible for those involved, war has over millennia made civilization safer. How can war make anything safer, you may ask? Or you may be sitting there, scoffing in your car or on the train, looking like a crazy person to all the other commuters, wondering how I find that interesting. If wars are fought to establish peace, then of course they make us safer. Well, listeners, that is a big if in my book. Well, if I had a book. I don't have a book, by the way. That is why I have to review other people's books on the show. If I had a book, I would just do a show about how awesome that is. Anyway, Coming back to the book, Morris uses the trends of history to demonstrate that war has continued to build, tear down, and rebuild different civilisations, making each one safer in turn. He provides arguments that 1. A global supercop or globocop wielding hegemonic power is not necessarily a bad thing. Rome's empire meant a safer life for those that dwelt within its borders. US dominance of the global stage has promoted Western liberal values that value the rights of individuals. His second point is that the risk of dying a violent death in civilisations has reduced dramatically since the Stone Age. Morris estimates that in the Stone Age, or in a Stone Age culture, individuals faced a 10 to 20% chance of dying a violent death. Then during the Ancient Empire period, i.e. when Rome was strong, that percentage dropped down to 2 to 5%. And by the 20th century, it got as low as 1 to 2%. He even points out that the safest place to live to avoid a violent death today is, well, oddly enough, it's a land full of Vikings and mermaids. That's right, the safest place in the world has a Tasmanian princess. I'm talking about Denmark, of course. Now, if you've been looking for a book that discusses Calgacus, Agricola, and near-nuclear strikes that were averted by courageous Soviet staff officers within the same binding, then this is the book for you. I've already mentioned that it is a long-duration history, or longue durée, as the more refined Francophiles call it. Now, what do I mean by long duration? Well, I'm talking a historical study over centuries and even millennia. Long-duration historians don't necessarily focus on a specific time period. They focus on a historical trend throughout different time periods. Kind of the way that I don't necessarily focus on just one type of donut, but I like to study all types of donuts to determine the overall trend and tastiness of donuts. Getting back to history though, Morris has recently delivered some very impressive addresses at the London School of Economics. For example, in February 2016, he delivered a talk called Each Age Gets the Bloodshed It Needs, 20,000 Years of Violence. So you can see, when we talk of Morris as long duration, we really mean long. If you want to know more about longue durée, but aren't keen on a large amount of reading, check out the History Manifesto by Joe Gouldy and David Armitage. It is free online at historymanifesto.cambridge.org. Other interesting points covered in the work include war amongst chimpanzees, bonobos apes, as well as ants. Not necessarily apes fighting ants, but it does seem that apes are maneuverists and ants are attritionists. In fact, the raids carried out by the chimps provide a good example of surfaces and gaps, whereas ants seem to follow the Nathan Forrest Bedford theory of getting there first with the most. In fact, when ants go to war, the winners make what Rome did to Carthage look like a humanitarian mission. They are a crazy bunch of annihilationists. In fact, if I were an ant-man, which I'm not, I favour butterflies, but if I were an ant-man, I'd train them to defend my borders. Morris's book is very well written and easy to follow for the layperson. You don't have to be an archaeologist, a long-duration historian, or a social scientist to understand or get a kick out of this book. It is good to go for the casual reader or barely literate podcast host. It was published by Profile Books in 2014 and can be found at any good bookstore or online at the usual haunts. For my Aussie listeners, I picked it up in an independent bookstore but have seen copies in every major chain. That's right, all three of them. Of course, we do need to provide you a rating before we go, and I have not yet told you about our rating system. We have a rating system. That system has 5 gradations. Much like the 5 stars you'll give us on iTunes, but with a little difference. We don't use stars, we use Carls. What is a Carl, you ask? Well, it's a measurement based on Big Carl himself. Now, Before I give you a rating, I have to give you a sample of the book. Otherwise, I've given you a review without quoting the book itself, and that's just bad form. And I'm not known for my bad form. Here's a little bit from the conclusion of the book. War has made the planet peaceful and prosperous. So peaceful and prosperous, in fact, that war has almost, but not quite, put itself out of business. Now, listeners, wouldn't that be quite nice? However, time to get on to the Carls. So, how many Carls do I give this book? Well, based on readability, the topic, and general usefulness for barbecue trivia moments, I give it 5 Carls. You probably guessed we're going to lead with a 5 Carl book, even if you had no idea what a Carl is. I'm still not sure. I know what a Carl is. But whatever the criteria is, Morris's book gets 5 of them. Now, listeners, for those who have or have not read the book, I would love to talk to you on social media about it. So feel free to jump on. Let's have a chat about that quote. War has made the world more peaceful and prosperous to the point where it's putting itself out of business. Keen to chat about that over the coming week. And that is the end of this short, sharp, and extremely informative episode. Next week we'll have Corey Sharkey on the show, and we will be chatting with her about the book she co-authored with Jim Mattis, the newly minted US Secretary of Defense. The topic will be warriors and citizens. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.